really anyone who wants to talk about entrepreneurship in Northwest Arkansas, that's what we're here for. So we do no-cost consulting, and then we also facilitate a really high cadence of events, such as this event you're participating in right now, events that are designed to highlight, showcase, celebrate, network, educate, inspire, and develop the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Northwest Arkansas. So once again, thank you for joining us. A little bit of housekeeping. If you've got a question, first of all, this event is being recorded. It's also being live streamed on Facebook right now. So if you've got somebody who doesn't want to miss this, ask them to join in on Facebook if they didn't get a registration link. Also, if you've got a question for Anna, who we're so honored to have with us today, you can use the Q&A feature or feel free to utilize the chat and just pop your question there. You can either send your question to me personally or to the general public. So with no further ado, I'm very excited to introduce Anna Mason. Anna Mason is a partner at Revolution Rise of the Rest Seed Fund, where she has led more than 50 investments. She currently serves on the board of AppHarvest, is a board observer for Kenzie Academy, Dispatch, and Collective Retreats. Anna also leads strategy for Rise of the Rest platform, which is anchored by the firm's Rise of the Rest road trip and has been covered widely in the media, including 60 Minutes and the New York Times. She has more than 15 years of experience in finance, startup operations, and venture community programming. Prior to joining the Revolution, Anna co-founded a fitness community startup called Burn This, which was later acquired by Beachbody, and co-led the Vignetta Project, DC, an organization supporting early-stage female founders in tech. She began her career on Wall Street as a distressed bond and post-reorg private equity trader, and then most recently as vice president of the Seaport Group. Anna received her BA in government from Harvard College and her MBA from the NYU Stern School of Business. She was named to Fortune's 40 Under 40 in 2020, Business Insider's list of 100 people transforming business in 2019, and a Washington Tech Titan in 2017 and 2018. She is a proud Washington, D.C. transplant and has visited more than 40 startup communities across the country, including our very own here in Northwest Arkansas. Anna, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I don't know if I'm on video yet. It looks like my video is disabled, but I'm happy.
Apologize for that. You should be able to share now.
There we go.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, everyone. Good to see you. That was a super long and kind intro. I'm definitely going to need to shorten up my bio. But wonderful to be back with everyone in NWA, even if it's virtual.
Thank you. Well, I didn't want to, pressure you on the video thing because some people like to remain shrouded in mystery, but it's great to see you. So thank you. Is there anything, not on your formal bio that you would like attendees to know before we get kicked off today?
My goodness, no, that was a really long bio.
Like your favorite ice cream flavor, anything pertinent that, we didn't cover.
I do think we noted that I'm a proud DC transplant.
Yeah.
Moved here from LA about 6 years ago, and it's where my husband and I are raising our two little girls who are fifth generation Washingtonians. So a fun fact about me is that I'm probably never leaving DC, but by extension, I'm really grateful to have found such a wonderful work community and family, not just here in DC with Revolution, but also sort of the extended family and community that I feel very privileged to be a part of through all the work that we've done traveling all across the country for so many years. So I can't wait to get back out on the road. And I'm looking forward to answering any and all questions folks have today.
That's awesome. It's incredible to have, community take so many forms. And so having close, physically present community, but also just a huge national and probably for you, international networking community to be plugged into. Well, I will add a little disclaimer that I forgot to include on my bio, which is that I, like many, am working from home. I have a very fluffy vintage 16-year-old golden doodle who I just heard make a little murmur sound. So I'm going to apologize in advance if I mute myself suddenly. It is to avoid an onslaught of agitated barking. So moving on, let's get started. And I'm going to start out with some questions. But again, this event is for all of you, our wonderful attendees. So please feel free to take advantage of the time and ask Anna any questions that you have at any point in the presentation. And you can do that again via the Q&A feature or in the chat. So Anna, you are, among so many things, an entrepreneur yourself. Would you tell us a little bit about, you know, what sort of set you on that trajectory to, you know, start a startup? You know, why did you go in the route of business rather than becoming a doctor or a lawyer? You know, what would you kind of credit that inclination?
Sure. So I grew up professionally on Wall Street. I was a distressed and high yield bond and bank debt trader. I had a front row seat to the Great Recession and the market dislocation, having worked in distressed at Lehman Brothers when we went bankrupt back in the day. And the way I think about my time on Wall Street is that I loved it, but I had to leave it. And that, in certain respects, was a big part of the start of my startup journey, my transition into entrepreneurship, and ultimately into the tech and venture community, which I think of very affectionately, actually, as the other side of the coin to distressed trading, where in venture, you know, you're still making big bets that can have very binary outcomes, but the fundamental and, to me, most heartening difference is that in venture, you're really betting on optimists who are just reimagining the future and saying it's always possible to create something where there was nothing before. I co-founded and built a startup in the health tech space. Where we ended was actually, like many startups, not quite where we started. We started in as part of the milieu of 4 or 5 companies who were all trying to productize and disrupt the boutique fitness and class booking space. For me personally, it was born out of you know, the personal aha and like the classic "there must be a better way" that really came from a very personal experience of having gone through some major health issues. I was sort of a Wall Street workout nut and found myself in a position where, due to extreme health reasons, I couldn't work out for 6 months. And, you know, so I was sort of flying high in my day job, wildly successful trading career, but like candidly felt super empty. And a lot of that was driven by my inability to sort of get the endorphins up. And I had a friend out on the West Coast who was a federal prosecutor who's, for different reasons, kind of going through the same recognition. And we said, you know, can a bond trader and a federal prosecutor figure out how to break into the tech and startup world?
That sounds like a great joke. Like,
yeah, it really was,
really
especially when we walked into a bunch of VCs, you know, as you know, two women from other industries. But we worked at building in that space. We raised a great, you know, seed round of capital. And what I will say by way of transition, so as not to bury the lead, is that a company called Classtivity, which ended up, most people now know it as ClassPass, a unicorn in the wellness space, really ended up being the breakout in our industry. And Burn This, our company, you know, ended up becoming like an also ran in that space. And one of the key learnings for me, I'll just jump right to the learning section of this. The key learning for me and for us that actually caused us to realize we weren't going to win in that space, and we had to quickly pivot in order to figure out how to make the business successful, was that we ultimately hung our hats on what was truly a feature in the space. So Burn This was originally conceived of as focusing on the social psychology of fitness, and what we tried to do was productize that social psychology around people really wanting to work out with their friends. And so we had a booking engine. We were partnered with MindBody, and it was all about connecting in and being able to book classes with your friends. Well, it turns out, in $1 billion valuation, you know, 8-9 years later has validated this, that's a wonderful, nice to have feature, very much so a vitamin, really not the painkiller that consumers needed. And ultimately, what's now been really well proven in the wellness space is that people care about price and they care about convenience. And if you can figure out how to productize that and actually do it in a way that removes the friction and paralysis of choice, then you can really win the day. So we pivoted our business. We stripped out all the booking capabilities. We relaunched as a social community and competition platform where we would partner with major brands, help them market their products almost on like an MLM model basis to consumers who would compete for these rewards and these goods and services. And one of the companies who we were partnered with, a large private company out of Southern California called Beachbody, actually ended up becoming our acquirer. And that's the story of Burn This.
What's the kind of time span of that whole story?
2012 to 2015.
Fast. Wow. You mentioned that people were concerned about price and concerned about convenience. Does that mean you think people are concerned about the price of the service or the price of the app, like not having to pay for a booking app, or are they concerned about the price of the actual like classes that they're taking?
Price of the actual classes that they're taking.
Really? Okay. Interesting. So what would you say to someone who, like you, wants to transition and penetrate a totally different industry that they maybe don't have experience or familiarity in? So going from Wall Street to, to the tech world. It's possible.
Yeah. So
very possible.
Yeah. So if you were transitioning, I think there are two ways to look at it. You're transitioning from a completely other industry, and maybe you had a consumer experience that drove you to say, oh, there must be a better way, and I'm going to switch gears and go figure out how to do that. One of the most important first steps to take is to not only take your advice and your own perspective on the industry. Like, you're looking to tap whatever industry it is, you're likely looking to tackle, disrupt, and reimagine a fairly sizable industry. So you or your close circle as a sample set of 1 or 2 or 5, it's very anecdotal. It's likely, colored by your own fairly narrow perspective and experiences. You have to really get out there and pressure test and poke holes in your own assumptions to really figure out what that major consumer or business pain point is, depending on whether or not you're building in a consumer or a B2B space. But I think first and foremost, you want to take yourself from, sort of the sample set of 1 to really getting in the weeds, just not being embarrassed or ashamed or shy to kind of roll up your sleeves and talk to the customer. And at every step of the way, kind of pressure test assumptions and build from there. That would be my baseline advice. Though I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about as we sort of grow from the baseline.
I mean, I think if I encouraged people to walk away hearing one thing, I would definitely see it too. We see this a lot with, folks in all sorts of industries. There's a real hesitancy to, get unbiased feedback on, your product or service or idea. And, because obviously you've discovered a solution, you want that solution to work. And so there's, I hear people say a lot, don't be afraid to call my baby ugly. But being actually able to receive that kind of feedback and then, actually, apply it in a meaningful way, it's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, so it's tricky, right? Because it's really nuanced, because on the one hand, entrepreneur, you're foundationally saying, I can create a better way. I can, I see something that maybe others don't see.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have to find the balance in not just listening, but hearing what some of the nuance and advice and perspective is, to really see if you can, to turn your idea into a business, you have to get people to be able to pay. You have to convince people to pay for it. And ideally, you have to convince people you don't know to pay for it. And I think the second piece of advice that I would give that I did not take when I was on the other side of the table in early stage startup world is to really lean into community. You can come at this from the perspective of, I was a captain of XYZ industry, and so I know what I'm doing. And the startup world and entrepreneurship is, it can be a little bit more difficult to navigate and sort of find the path. And so our team knows, like, I often use the term shortcut Sherpa, but you want to find your shortcut Sherpas in the industry, because at the end of the day, you're trading equity, you're trading capital for equity, and the best way to realize a return on that capital and ultimately really scale is to be able to be maximally efficient in how you deploy that capital. So if you have to go out and spend $100,000 on something because you've never done it before and you waste 90,000 of it to find the right way to get to that best, highest use, if you had someone in your network who said, actually, you could just get this done for $10,000, you've now got 90,000 that you can go spend somewhere else. And it's every step of the way, there are more often than not process-oriented shortcuts around how to either build the infrastructure for your business, irrespective of the industry that you're in, or figure out, how to, produce XYZ, get the right tech stack and infrastructure. A lot of that is relatively commoditized in the industry right now. You just have to have and be willing to build the network connections to help you develop those shortcuts, so you can just get right to the heart of the matter and building your business as fast as possible.
Would you say that helping kind of facilitate that community, those networks, those connections, is part of what Revolution's Rise of the Rest exists to do?
Yeah, that's actually probably like what our, unofficial bumper sticker pretty much reads. But we, our investment thesis, so Rise of the Rest is a lot of things. At its core now, we are a $300 million early stage venture fund investing in largely seed stage startups in cities all across the country, with the exception of Silicon Valley, New York City, and Boston, where we don't invest. But before we were a fund, we were a network. Before we were a network, we were a bus tour. And before we were a bus tour, we were really a clarion call to the industry and stakeholders all across the country that venture capital really is the on-ramp to economic development and access and opportunity. And if venture capital investment is being concentrated in just 3 places in the country, then you're really not giving the vast majority of entrepreneurs a fair shake and a shot at the American dream that's most often realized through entrepreneurship. So by extension, in sort of bringing all those pieces of the Rise the Rest puzzle full circle, I would say network and community are truly at the heart of all we do. It's why we, since 2014, have literally gotten on a bus to meet people where they are, both figuratively and literally, but also work behind the scenes. And it's an effort that my colleague Jamie Rodota, our director of platform strategy, now leads, to build relationships in a really 360 way with communities, not just with startups and investors, but with all stakeholders in a community, in the public and private sector, because there are so many different stakeholders and types of organizations that all plug in to build those communities. And it's absolutely a North Star for us.
That's awesome. And how long, maybe tell us a little bit about your journey to Revolution's Rise with the Rest.
I moved to DC when I was 5 months pregnant with my oldest daughter, who's now 5.5. And a week after I got here, I got put on bed rest. So I was in a new city, was in the process of going through the acquisition process with Burn This, which I was doing remotely, and my co-founder was managing directly in Southern California. And I had literally been to one like startup community event before I got put on bed rest. So new city, new baby, sort of like angrily locked up in a room, stressing about, new motherhood. And when I was about 38.5 weeks pregnant, they decided the cake was baked, so to speak. And so it was safe for me to kind of get back up again. I had gained like 65 pounds. I was a pretty angry whale at the time. And I quite literally waddled in to go meet with a woman who was leading this local startup support initiative to support early stage female founders in tech called the Veneta Project. And that was the only event that I had been to before being put on bed rest. And so I asked her for advice. She actually asked me if I wanted to join her in scaling the initiative and the organization locally in DC. She was also an entrepreneur. And honestly, I was so grateful that anyone would take me seriously in my wildly pregnant state that I just was like, when can I start? She's like, well, maybe you should have the baby first. And I was like, but when can I start? Like, put me in, coach. And so I ended up, my daughter was born in late October. Our acquisition of Burn This closed in December. And I was sort of off to the races, just kind of leaning in and volunteering my time to build this awesome organization that scaled to about 1,300 people and stakeholders in the DC community. And we just did a ton of work helping to connect female founders to local capital, not just hard dollars, but also all the soft capital and infrastructure that we all know goes into scaling businesses. And through the universe, that led me to Revolution. And is just an incredible opportunity at the time. This was before we had the fund, and it was really just coming on to lead the tour initiative, manage and lead the personal investments that Steve Case was doing at the time at the early stage fund. And I sort of had this neat portfolio of professional experiences that was a cross of financial experience, startup experience, and startup support experience that sort of rolled up into Rise the Rest. So I'm grateful to the universe for having brought me to it. And I think if I had to, from the proverbial peanut gallery, offer a piece of perspective and advice to folks who are trying to figure out the lateral career change, because it's so challenging and it's so daunting, and especially if you're in a new city, is in so much as you can from your own personal sort of financial setup, try to lean in and find an organization that you're really passionate about and you really align with, and you can kind of employ that Brad Feld give first mentality and mantra, because you end up connecting with people on a larger scale level. It wasn't, hey, this is Anna Mason looking for a job. It was, hey, I'd love to tell you about the Veneta Project and why I'm so passionate about supporting female founders and where the opportunity still exists in the space. And it just creates a different layer, I think, of connection. And I think it's something that in any community all across the country, you can find opportunities to lean in and make your mark in a startup community. And you never know where that will take you from there.
Great advice in any capacity or industry. Just, like being a successful human is, lean in and find where you can add value in a space that is something that you're energetic and passionate about. It's amazing. So speaking of Rise with the Rest, you all recently invested in two Northwest Arkansas startups, Ox, formerly Oculox, and Acre Trader. And these are both companies that we've worked with Startup Junkie, and have just been so energized and excited to see their growth, and very, very excited that you see the value of what they're doing as well. So what would you say for the potential of Northwest Arkansas as a venture ecosystem, given that it's often, perceived to be flyover country?
Well, if it's any indication, right before I hopped on here, I was doing an interview for publication asking about what cities I'm excited about in the Northwest Arkansas region, Bentonville and Fayetteville, were so amongst the first cities to sort of roll off the tongue. And so
all right, that's what we like to hear. Thank you.
I'm Jamie and I and the rest of our team have spent a fair amount of time over the last year really continuing to build on the relationships that we originally established for the 9th Rise the Rest Tour, which obviously we've had to put on ice during COVID. But a real silver lining there has just been so much more opportunity to do things like this that continue to keep us connected. But I first visited the region in 2017 and have been 4 times. And we're real students at Rise of the Rest of ecosystem development and startup community development. And I have to say, it's really been inspiring to watch all the moving parts and all the building blocks, both from so many organizations that have been around and that are OG, like Startup Junkie, and others that have, sort of through partnership been brought into the community. I think there's a real build by partner mentality that's actually critical to ecosystem building and really laying the groundwork for those infrastructure layers. So, a perspective I often offer is that cities are like startups. And so when for startups, oftentimes, you'll have investors say, what's your tech stack? And I think if you think about a city, you want to ask kind of what the tech stack is, so to speak, from an infrastructure standpoint, but you also want to understand what the community stack is and what that looks like. And I think a lot of thought and infrastructure and planning has gone into the development and evolution of the startup community there. Ox and Acre Trader were both 2 of the companies that actually had applied for the pitch competition in the Rise the Rest 9.0 tour. And so while our big red bus hasn't officially rolled through yet, we're really grateful and delighted that we had those early opportunities to connect that led to ultimately investments as part of really great syndicates. Like, I'm thrilled that Rise the Rest has our first points on the board in Arkansas, but I'm even more fired up that Jump Capital and Naria VC and Mac Capital and KC Rise Fund and Atento are also now investors in the community. So that is very much so, I think, what Rise the Rest is all about. We're a traditional VC fund, but we really have that thread line around community and connectivity and catalyzing more capital to come into to come into all these regions. So to me, it's really far from just being about us, but it's about these awesome syndicates of co-investors who now get that you can build a scalable tech-enabled company in a place like Northwest Arkansas. And we at Rise the Rest have the opportunity not only to offer our perspective on why we believe in the company as an investment opportunity, but we can also share with our co-investors and the community more broadly why we think Northwest Arkansas is a uniquely special place to be able to do that. And I was super fired up to actually do that directly on one of the calls with one of the investors. I was like, have you ever actually been to Bentonville? He was like, no, I haven't. I was like, let me tell you about Bentonville. And so we're glad that we get to be, and feel grateful that we get to be sort of extended ambassadors to cities all across the country.
Well, thank you for, you know, being the literal and figurative kind of boots on the ground, exploring and then highlighting and showcasing just, you know, what makes our region unique, but also uniquely competitive on the, you know, entrepreneurial landscape. So, you know, shamelessly, I just have to know, what were all those great reasons that you, you know, were telling people they've got to look at Northwest Arkansas? So what do you see? Just compliment us here, just, you know,
Sure.
just.
Sure. I think the region is one of a small handful across the country who really got ahead of the curve that now seems obvious to so many in this COVID Zoom land era, where we've seen this great redistribution of talent all across the country, where it's not just about where you work or what the tech industry looks like, but it's, you have to build for the whole person. And so it's about work, live, and play. It's about community. It's you know, what would I do when I'm not working if I lived here, and does that compel me to want to move there and to move to that place? And I think the region has taken a very holistic and detailed approach to that, whether it's the film festival or the Heartland Summit or the great mountain biking, the awesome restaurants that are now downtown, you know, sort of so you have all that sort of the setting of the proverbial table, and then you have a dozen plus really neat things emerging on the actual startup and tech scene, like sort of the main event or the main course, so to speak. And I know, you know, we featured some of the emerging work in Northwest Arkansas in the 3rd annual Rise the Rest ecosystem playbook that we released this past year. And it was really about how communities responded and reacted to their startup communities and to their startups in the post-COVID era. And I think what was so resonant for me and for us with respect to Northwest Arkansas was the sheer number of new programs, organizations, products being launched in support of startups or reimagined in support of startups. Mm-hmm. And this sort of like, we will run through walls mentality to not cancel any of that, just reimagine and repurpose it for a digital, you know, for a digital environment. So, you know, it was like 2020 was set to really be a breakout year for the region with so much of what was coming online. And I hope on the ground it worked out as well as it appears to us to have worked sort of the view from afar in terms of what was rolled out digitally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was a banner year in some good ways and some bad ways, you know, for our region and for everywhere else. Well, I'm going to just give you a warning. I'm going to ask you this, like maybe one of the last questions that I asked, so you can be thinking about it. But I'm going to ask you, what's the funnest thing that you've done in Northwest Arkansas? So, you know, you can be stewing about it if it's nothing, you know, if you've got like a lot of answers that immediately pop to your mind, because it is a pretty fun place to work, live, and play. I agree.
Yeah.
So what would you tell an entrepreneur who's thinking about relocating to a coast, you know, who's in a traditional flyover state? Maybe they, you know, are in Northwest Arkansas, maybe they're in another community that doesn't have as many like concentrated, you know, resources for entrepreneurs. What would your encouragement or advice be to that?
Sorry, the question is someone who's thinking of leaving, not someone who's thinking of coming. Well, first I would have to say, like everyone's got to do what they've got to do. So we don't, you know, for us at Rise the Rest, it's really not zero sum. We don't hate on Valley, New York, and Boston. We have awesome friends and co-investors and things like that there. And if you're like, this is my shot to go to New York, then who are we to tell you not to do that? But I think, you know, what's always been so powerful for me, I've personally been to, I guess, about 45 cities across the country, is that you can, like travel, you can have the experience of being a tourist, or you can have the experience of seeing the city as a local, right? And there's a real nuance to that. And I've always found that finding your way into a startup community really just can give you that sense of optimism and possibility, and really just this can-do, conquer, you know, sort of spirit and attitude. And so I think that what I would say is, if you're thinking about leaving, you should ask yourself whether or not you've had the opportunity and you've given yourself the opportunity and the on-ramp to try to experience and find that in your own backyard. And if you haven't done that yet, it might be worth sort of circling around the local water cooler on that front and figuring out how you can plug in locally. Because there's one of the things I've always been so encouraged by and taken with in startup communities all across the country, is that once you do find that initial entry point or access point, the broader access and opportunity can be pretty awesome and pretty staggering and much more meaningful and impactful than you might necessarily find in a major but and so the on-ramp can be tricky, and I don't take that lightly at all. But before you fully consider leaving, I would see whether or not you feel like you fully experience the local startup community and all it has to offer.
Great advice. So with the Rise of the Rest, you guys get a little bit, or do you guys get a little bit into kind of the policy side of things? And if so, do you have any kind of recommendations that you would make for us to advocate for on a policy level here in Northwest Arkansas that would, you know, make the state or this region even more appealing to entrepreneurs, supportive, and competitive on that landscape?
I will say, it's funny, we did a clubhouse actually last week, featuring Northwest Arkansas and Tulsa and the emerging remote work programs and initiatives in both, and it got a little spicy around the politics, sort of the city versus state dynamic, and I think without what I will say, without maybe necessarily going into any specifics, is that policy is one of the many P's that we focus on with intention at Rise the Rest. We've got people, we've got place, we've got partnership, and policy is way up there too. And so I think it's perhaps, rather than offering specific advice, I would say generally our orientation is that you always want to invite policymakers to the table, because it's important for them to have a first-person perspective on the challenges, the innovations, the opportunities, the obstacles that startups in their own backyard face. And that's often where just literally getting that plurality of perspectives at the table is so often where possibility and change and momentum can come about. So I've often found that some of the persistent, or rather consistent feedback that we might hear in cities all across the country is that policymakers and entrepreneurs feel like they speak different languages. And so sometimes it's, you know, it can even come down to like the opacity of a government website. Like you tell us you're doing all this great stuff. We go to your website, we literally don't, it doesn't even sound like English. Like we don't know what this says, what it means, where to find opportunities. So I think the baseline orientation of making sure that you can get policymakers at the table and you can determine whether or not you're speaking the same language is a critically important sort of foundational step. And sure, absolutely, there are some specific policy recommendations around engagement that I think can flow from there.
That's awesome. I think, you know, we often hear in policy conversations like, okay, we need to get the party concerned in front of the policy makers. But I like this, you know, kind of inverse of that, like, no, just invite them to the table, make sure they're a part of the conversation, invite them into your space so that they have, you know, that like, oh no, I know my constituents and their concerns in this space because I've been a part of those conversations. That's awesome. Well, do we have, I'm keeping an eye on the chat here. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask Anna while we are here on the call? We'll give it a few minutes. And then Caleb, I don't have the Facebook Live pulled up on my screen. So if you see anything there, feel free to copy and paste it in the chat or hop in if you're seeing any questions over there. So does anybody have any questions for Anna? I believe we've got all of our participants muted, so you will have to type them in for us, I'm afraid. And while we give folks a minute there, let's see, have you had any thought about my what's your funnest thing you've done in Arkansas question?
It's funny, when I typically travel on work trips, because I am a mom of young kids, I often try to fit in like 3 days worth of activities in like 19 hours. And so for me, it's always about the people, which I hope is not a cop-out answer. But I will say, sort of a fun throwback through time for me was going to like the Sam's Five and Dime and finding all these old toys that they still sell for like $3 that I played when I was a kid, and could sort of buy them and figure out how to fit them in my suitcase to introduce to my kids. Was a sort of one of those only in Arkansas types of experiences that I really appreciated.
Well, I hope you have so many more only in Arkansas experiences. Best is yet to come, I'm sure.
Yeah.
All right, we've got some questions and comments pulling into the chat. So Jeanette, hello Jeanette, great, thanks for joining us. She said that Clubhouse chat did get a little spicy, but that it was a compelling conversation we're glad we got to address. She said, love that Rise of the Rest focuses on people, place, policy, and plurality of perspectives, all the pieces. And so important to share the same vocabulary and be open to firsthand accounts of what's happening on the ground for startups. Absolutely. She said, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much. Awesome. Thank you so much for that feedback, Jeanette. Alyssa asked, in communicating with customers or clients to request their feedback, what are some of the most effective ways to do that based on your experience, Anna?
Let me see this in. So there are actually a number of, I think there are a number of, now that in my time since I've now been on, the venture and investor side of things for the last five plus years, there've actually been a number of really interesting tools that have come out of the market that that help you really do this effectively. But honestly, the best path forward is literally the straight, simple line. Like, don't go with a gimmick. Don't go with something that screams of spam. And don't write like a 47-page email. I think your goal is you want to try to get on the phone with someone, which is trickier in this day of age, right? One of the great ironies, I think, of our increasingly digitally connected era is that we are, in some respects, more disconnected in person than we ever have been before. And so, if you can meet in person, you should, obviously not necessarily from a customer standpoint, but just from a relationship management standpoint. If you can get on the call, don't take the email. If you can take the email, like, don't text. If you can text, don't like snap or whatever the cool kids are doing these days.
I wouldn't know.
So I think, the most important thing to recognize when getting this feedback is that they are people. And so you really just want to try to communicate, on a very natural human level. And I generally think that wins the day. I see another question here. What's the number one most valuable attribute of a great entrepreneur? I'm actually not sure I could go with just one, but I will say, resilient. I'll give you maybe my top three. Resilience is incredibly important. And there has been no other time, I think, where we've seen that more than in 2020, where, you'll often hear people talk about the wartime versus peacetime CEO. But the most resilient entrepreneurs actually had so many other attributes that rolled up under that. You have to really have deep empathy and have a high EQ to think through how to deal with all of the nuance, the 360 nuances of what your team is going through and what your customers might be going through particularly challenging times. You have to have this sort of vision and strategic insight to be able to take yourself out of the weeds where you operate and pull yourself up to that view from 10,000 or that view from 30,000, where you can actually assess the landscape in real time, and say, not just, where is the ball right now, but where is it going and how am I going to be the first to get there? And so I think so many other attributes roll up under resilience. Because one of the trickiest things I think about entrepreneurship is, like, you can be your own greatest advocate or your own worst enemy. And so much of it gets wrapped up, I actually think, in the sort of mental wellness side of entrepreneurship. And you literally drop everything and you jump off this cliff to start this business because you just desperately believe the world, the industry, your community needs it to create a better space. And you can really almost like fall into this vacuum of thinking the sun really rises and sets with the success of your business. And so having the ability to sort of kind of both operate in the weeds while pulling yourself out of the weeds, I think, is a whole other level of resilience that's really important, that's really critical. And the last thing I would say that I think stands on its own, irrespective of like wartime, peacetime, is really something we screen for, is honesty. I think I've found, and I've experienced from having also been an entrepreneur, it can be really tricky to navigate the entrepreneur-investor relationship and like what you feel like you can share, what you feel like you can't share. As an investor, I strive to be the sounding board where you'll be faster to come to me with bad news than with good news, so that we and your other circle of champions can help problem solve around that, maybe before it's a 5-alarm fire. And that's it's a tricky relationship, I think, to build, and it's one we think a lot about. I see Jeanette's question. Since you're approaching I think I lost it there. Since you're approaching the bus tours with digital, how else can, well, I will say we, our Rise of the Rest team actually went out a couple months ago and sent out a note to all of the applicants, original applicants from Rotor 9 pitch competition, and invited them to re-engage with us and re-pitch their business. If there was an update, we ended up, candidly, just from a bandwidth standpoint, we were able to take the first 55 or 60 or so meetings. We had close to 500 applicants across all the cities. Wow. We weren't able to re-engage with everyone, but I think in general, if you applied, you hopefully have one of our emails, and we're always happy to hear from founders and get an update on the business, and do our best to track from there.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I know we've got a hard stop at 4. I don't see any other questions in the chat, just some great feedback and a lot of appreciation. Tim summarizes very well. Be resilient, not resistant. That's a quote from Elise Mitchell. Any other, I think we've got time for one more. Are there any other burning questions that you really would like to pop in the chat here before we sign off for the evening? I think Zoom needs to incorporate like some sound effects, like the, Jeopardy or.
Well, I'll thank everyone so much for inviting me to spend some time with you all, and we can't wait to get back down in person. So thanks for having us.
Awesome. Anna, thank you for joining us. Thanks to all of our attendees. And this has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to share it with all of your friends later on. All right. Thanks again, Anna. We really appreciate you. Thanks, and everybody have a wonderful Thursday night.